So we are continuing our conversation here this afternoon. I'm Father Kyle Ingels.
And I'm Deacon Patrick.
And in our last installment of our conversation, we were talking about reconciliation, and especially right now, in light of the challenges we're all facing, many situations where people are not able to get to reconciliation. But we want to talk a little bit now about the domestic church, our living situations, and reconciliation with one another, because obviously reconciliation with God and with neighbor are both very, very important. So we talked a lot about in our last installment about reconciliation with God, but we want to focus now on reconciliation with others. So I'm lucky, Deacon Patrick, because since I live by myself, I only have to worry about offending myself or fighting with myself. But it's more challenging for other people right now who are living maybe with more people, and people have moved back home and things like that. So I know your situation, you have a lot more people under your roof than I do right now, for sure.
Well, and there's also situations where husbands and wives, they worked full time, and now one or both aren't. And if one is, they're essential, and they might be on the front lines in the hospital, and that brings about a whole lot of stress on top of stress on top of stress. And those stresses add up, and everything from young kids running around squabbling because they feel what's going on, and so they're not at school, life is different, they feel the differences and the tensions that the adults are struggling with. Then you throw on top of that any older siblings that are back, any other family members that might be there, and spouses who are now spending more time than perhaps even when they first were meeting each other, courting or dating. And that's a whole nother level of how do we do this whole relationship thing? Does the church have anything to offer us to help us navigate this nitty gritty? We're kind of used to, we go to Mass on Sunday, and then depending on all sorts of things, we're at work and we're doing school and we're out to eat, and then we're back at church once a week. What does this look like to integrate faith into our everyday life, especially these harder parts? And one of the things that our family discovered as I went through the diaconate, and as we had a growing family, and then we were homeschooling and learning how to do that, which is another good topic we'll have to do in the future, of how do you dive in and do homeschooling. Most homeschool families take about a year to adjust to that. That's a wee preview of what we might get to later. But the realization we came to is the big R reconciliation sacrament of reconciliation in the church, granted by Christ through a priest. The anatomy of that, the biology of that, is the same when you're talking about two siblings needing to apologize, or when I mess up with my wife and I need to apologize to her. What does that look like? So I thought you could maybe, Father Kyle, go through, what are the one at a time, and then we can translate what does it look like in the confessional, and then what does that look like when you're at the dining room table or the living room coffee table?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right in the sense that there's a lot of similarities in how we prepare ourselves to reconcile ourselves to God, and how we prepare to reconcile ourselves to each other. And obviously, we should be striving to see the reflection of God in all the other people that we encounter, whether it be people we like, people we don't like, our friends, our enemies, our family, acquaintances. So, I think a big part of that comes from just a strong interior life and also a strong sense of how we want God to see us, and we want to be people who are patient and people who are loving and people who are kind, and then how we want others to see us. And obviously none of us are perfect, so we have to face the reality. And I know it's a shocking thing. I'll tell you one, not to get off topic here, but one time I went to the mall to go to confession. We have our wonderful Capuchins who hear confessions at the mall. They're not able to do it right now because of the pandemic, but they're there a lot and they hear a lot of confessions. And I walked up and there was a line, not a long line, but there were some people sitting there in the chairs. And this one lady, she looked up at me as I walked up toward the line, and she goes, "Oh my gosh, Father, what are you doing here?" And I said to her, "Well, I'm glad you're sitting down. I'm glad you're sitting down for this, but priests sin too." And everybody started laughing. But, so we're all works in progress, and I think that one of the things we can think about right now is we know that God is very patient with us. We see many examples of that. And we have to be patient with each other, especially in a time like this. People are under added stress, and many of the circumstances you mentioned of, different stresses people are under. We have to give each other a little bit of an extra break, I think, with being patient, being kind. But if we have wronged each other, the first step really in reconciling ourselves, whether it be with God or with others, is just taking responsibility for our sins and taking responsibility for our imperfections and being humble enough to know that we need to be forgiven.
So let me jump in there, because one of the things in family life is, and that as parents, my wife and I are called to help our kids learn, is how to recognize when there is a sin. And that usually comes from somebody being frustrated with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so in family life, yes, we need to recognize the sin that we've committed, but a pre-step to that is that examination of conscience comes from other people going, wait.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like Jesus on the road to Emmaus is walking along with the two disciples, and there's a part of that gospel that we often forget. And it's Jesus says to them after hearing, well, we fled from Jerusalem, and yeah, they said that Jesus, the women said that Jesus was not in the tomb. He hears their story, and he hears their fear that had them fleeing, and he says, "Oh, how foolish you are." And as family, we need to learn how to, one, tell each other, "Oh, how foolish you are," and two, how to hear, "Oh, wait, I'm the foolish one. I'm the fool this time." And that takes growing humility to be able to understand. Yeah, that was me. So that's a great example of going to the confessional. We've already recognized our sin.
Mm-hmm.
But in family life, where that strife is where the sin is. Wherever, and this is an axiom of life, wherever there's strife, there is sin. Now, whose sin and how it's hiding, that's a whole other question. But where there's strife, there's sin. And so, when I, to bring it down to sort of romper room level, when I want to whack my wife over the head with my toy truck, that might be my problem. And so then, yes, it's that how do we recognize it? And in our family, we really simplify it by focusing on what are the 7 deadly sins.
Mm-hmm.
because they contain all the other subsets of sins. Any sin we do is one of, or leads to one of the deadly sins. So if you got those 7, it really cuts through the noise to help realize what is it that I did wrong here.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we've had one of our younger daughters wigging out, and they're just too much Easter candy, or getting them to sit down, calm down, and how is that pride helping them see you're not paying attention, you're being selfish, and you're not being mindful about what others are doing, and you're crashing into them. And then they can see it, and then they can go to the next step, which in the confessional is.
You mean once one is inside the confessional?
Right. So in the confessional, I come to you and I know what my sin is. I admit it. Now what happens?
Well,
What's I got to do to make it right?
Yeah. So after you make your good confession, which includes true sorrow, a firm purpose of amendment, which is a desire to not repeat the sin, then the priest.
So let me stop you there, though. It's because in society, it's common to say, sorry, and then both parties walk away. Is that reconciliation?
No, I mean, you have to have a true sorrow, which is not just a perfunctory, like saying you're sorry because you don't want to get in trouble, but because you truly are concerned for the well-being of the other.
My bad, and then we go on. That doesn't work.
Right. You have to have that strong desire to move, to repair the relationship, and certainly it doesn't mean that we always have to be best friends with everybody and things, but again, it goes back to seeing the dignity of the other person, because that dignity comes from God.
And dignity is one of those fancy theological words. We talked in an earlier episode about God's desire for a deep, abiding desire for eternal relationship with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so he breathes his breath into us, a unique breath at our conception that each one of us is called to breathe into the world. That breath is our soul, and that breath gives us a unique value, meaning, and purpose. So in simple family language, our value, meaning, and purpose is what we mean when we say, as egghead theologians, what is human dignity? And it's that idea of God gave me a value and a meaning and a purpose beyond what anybody can think of. And I'm trying to uncover that purpose from being covered up by my sin. And that's why it's so important that we do so deeply and genuinely, not just in passing of, yeah, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
The other person has to also listen and hear it as God listens to us and hears it.
Very true.
So then you mentioned, okay, so now you have to have a genuine desire to make right relationship, to heal what I broke. So if I've wronged you, I've broken right relationship between Deacon Patrick and Father Kyle. I've apologized to you now. I'm sorry for being prideful, for whatever it was I did. Because I need to be specific, just like in the confessional. I need to be specific enough that I'm not giving the sinner any place to hide, but not so specific that I'm repeating the sin.
Mm-hmm.
But is that enough? Have I then made relationship right at that point?
Well, in relationship to confession, then the priest would grant you absolution, which is the acceptance of that reconciliation.
And so in just our private relationship, that would be you forgiving me. It's not the forgiveness of God through the priest,
Mm-hmm.
even though you're a priest. This is just a you forgiving me personal.
Right. It's the sincere acceptance of one's apology. I accept your apology, and let's move forward, basically.
So then what happens in the confessional? And this is another part that's missed in the domestic church.
Well, after the priest gives absolution, part of that would be imposing a penance, which is making restitution or satisfaction. It's not always exactly equal to the sin, but it's an act of reparation. It's an act of making satisfaction to God or to one's neighbor. So,
well, if we truly understood sin, there's no way it could be equal to the sin.
Right.
So in family life, what we've found that looks like is if we had one of our daughters wigging out and they threw something across the floor, they made a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not only do they have to clean up that mess, but whoever they wronged, they need to do one of their chores. That's
Right.
An example that we do. That's that parallel of penance.
Mm-hmm.
Of how do you make it right? Because yes, you need to apologize and you need to be specific, and that apology needs to be accepted, but then you need to heal the relationship that you broke, and you can't just go on without doing that, because there's this rift, and that rift leads to greater friction if it's not filled in. And in me, because I sinned against you, I have a pattern of sin, and I need to break that pattern, because I will fall for it more easily if I don't break it intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
And so we find that in family life, the penance, and we will refer to it as either penance or what are you going to do to make it right, is very much related to whatever the sin was. And you had mentioned earlier, it's really hard to break repetitive sin or patterns of sin. And that happens in family life all the time, especially as kids are growing up and they're learning, well, what does it look like to be my own person? And yet I'm under a roof and I'm under the authority of my parents. And how do I do that? And whether they're the toddler 2 tantrums or the teenage 16 tantrums, they're the same basic challenge of how do I be my own person under authority? And learning to respect that authority in family life is key to how do we function in society as an individual, but subject to the authority that's just put there by God over us.
Yeah, that's a lot to chew on, for sure. A lot to think about. It's an ongoing process every single day, for sure.
And it's a great gift to dive into the church and realize everything that happens in the home is a reflection of the church and God's grace, and prepares us for when we can return to Mass, which is the source and summit of our faith life.
Mm-hmm.
And we're missing that summit. A lot of that hunger we're feeling more and more is that hunger for the summit, so that we can be sustained and go through the next week. That next week has become now a month, and will be longer. We don't know how long. And one of the challenges that happens with all of the different restrictions that we're under is that families are experiencing all kinds of loss, and the dangers of people falling into depression or bouts with anger or other patterns of sin. And people will respond, well, depression isn't a sin. No, but underneath the depression is a fundamental not trusting God's wild abundance. And the church can help with that. So yes, there's a need for mental health professionals, but mental health professionals can't provide reconciliation. They don't have the power of the keys. And the healing of the soul is an essential aspect of our whole health. How do we go about, as the church, helping to heal souls facing those more acute challenges when the avenues of shepherding are further apart and have to happen through technology or drive-through confession? And so that's one of the things that we'll be talking about next time.
Great.
And also want to remind people to contact your parish through their website, the diocese through their website, with whatever needs you have. And we'll work to connect you with resources to help. I'm Deacon Patrick Jones.
And I'm Father Kyle Ingels.
May God startle you with joy.